The USS England's Historical Pursuit of Submarines, an account from May of 1944. May 13th, 1944. This message is from the Fleet Radio Unit in the Pacific, located at Pearl Harbor. The intercepted Japanese characters were being converted into English letters as the pencil of the codebreakers scraped over the page. The following message is from Submarine I-16. Buka, Southern Bougainville, is scheduled to receive a cargo of rice. Taking off soon. After putting down his coffee, Lieutenant Commander Robert Williamson grabbed for the secure telephone. The following 3 destroyer escorts would intercept: the USS England, the USS George, and the USS Raby. What none of them were aware of was that this single decrypted communication would set off the most catastrophic search for submarines in the history of naval warfare. American troops learned from their experiences in the Pacific War that Japanese submarines were not just instruments of war. They were sources of salvation. If those supply routes were severed, the whole garrison would be left to starve. A patrol line that reached from Truk Island to the Admiralty Islands was formed by the 7th Submarine Squadron of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The 7 submarines in question are the I-16, the RO-104, the RO-105, the RO-106, the RO-108, the RO-116, and the RO-117. The underwater sentries of Admiral Somu Toyoda, who were stationed in order to perceive any movement by the American Navy in the direction of the Palau Islands or the Marianas. Her Buckley-class hull, which displaced 1,400 tons of seawater, propelled the USS England over the Pacific swells at a speed of 23 knots. Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton was standing on the bridge, analyzing the tactical layout. 2 racks for depth charges, 8 K-guns capable of throwing 300-pound charges over a distance of 150 yards, and a 24-barrel Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar which was located ahead of the bridge and would go down in naval history, comprised the armory of his ship, which was expressly built to destroy submarines. The ship carried 186 personnel. The most formidable example of British engineering was the Hedgehog. Hedgehog missiles detonated only when they came into contact with solid things, which is different from depth charges, which detonated at predetermined depths. The generated text has been blocked by our content filters. The maths was really difficult. Out of 80 tries, traditional depth charges were successful in only 1 attack. The Hedgehog was successful in 1 out of every 5 attacks. The numbers had been drilled into Executive Officer John Williamson's mind by his extensive study of them. Equipped with a Cambridge education and a knack for mathematics and physics, Williamson realized that ultimately, submarine warfare was a matter of geometry. He understood that sound waves traveled through water at a speed of 4,800 feet per second, that target depth estimates were necessary, and that assault angles were important. The margin between a successful strike and a failed attempt was frequently determined by only fractions of a degree and timing that was just a fraction of a second. On the Japanese submarine I-16, Lieutenant Commander Tetsuyoshi Yoshitaka went over his cargo manifest, which consisted of rubber sacks that weighed 75 pounds and were loaded with rice. The experience he had gained from 9 prior war patrols had taught him that running supplies was one of the most perilous jobs in the Imperial Navy. Surface ships were able to draw in aircraft. Submarines attracted destroyer escorts that were outfitted with more advanced detecting systems. The I-16 was powered by diesel engines on the surface and electric motors below. Its submerged displacement was 2,180 tons. Her crew of 94 men had been able to withstand strikes by American destroyers, depth charges dropped by planes, and close contacts with submarines belonging to the Allies. However, the submarine's greatest vulnerability continued to be the same issue that affected other diesel-electric submarines: the necessity to surface in order to replenish air and charge the batteries. As the American ships drew closer to the intercept area, they established a line-abreast search configuration. USS George was on the port side, USS Raby was on the starboard side, and USS England was in the middle. Every destroyer escort was equipped with surface search radar, which was referred to as SG, and sonar equipment, which was referred to as QC. They used these devices to sweep the ocean. The sonar operators operated in shifts that lasted 15 minutes. They were able to calibrate their hearing to discern between the songs of whales, thermal layers, schools of fish, and the unique metallic echo that is characteristic of a submarine hull. For a period of 18 months, Sonarman First Class David Chun had been following contacts throughout the Pacific. He spun the head of the transducer through its search pattern as his hands worked mechanically across the sonar controls. He would halt every few degrees, emit a ping, and listen for the echo reply. The water surface was smooth, and the conditions were perfect for the transmission of sound. Temperature layers are at their lowest. There are no heat barriers that serve to disperse the acoustic beam. Chun was wearing his earbuds when, at 13:35 on May 19th, they crackled with what could only be described as the unmistakable hallmark of an echo from a submarine. Bearing of 090 degrees relative, range of 2,000 yards. He grabbed for the sound-powered telephone and punched the alarm button at the same time. Sonar has detected a submarine, and it is on a positive contact with a range of 2,000 and a bearing of 090, says the bridge. The hydrophone operator stated that the characteristic ping of American sonar could be heard on the bridge of I-16, and quick dive was the command given by Lieutenant Commander Yoshitaka. In times of emergency, pressurized air was explosively released to open the ballast tank vents. As the ballast tanks filled with thousands of tons of salt water, the bow of the submarine slanted downward. 45 seconds are required for the submarine to reach periscope depth. 2 minutes and 15 seconds are required to reach 100 feet. Williamson, the executive officer, charted out the attack geometry on the bridge chart table. The speed of the target is anticipated to be 8 knots. Head in a southwesterly direction to reach Bougainville. The depth is unclear, however, it is most likely somewhere between 100 and 200 feet during evasive maneuvers. The accuracy of the Hedgehog was dependent upon accurate depth computations and target prediction, even though its effective range was 270 yards. At 13:41, England launched its first offensive. The generated text has been blocked by our content filters. The missiles collided with the water and submerged themselves at a speed of 8 feet per second. There will be no explosions. Clear miss. Williamson made several revisions to his figures. By using the thermal layer at 150 feet, the submarine was able to hide its acoustic signature, which suggests that it had most likely descended to a greater depth than anticipated. He made the call to change direction and got himself ready for the second assault. The generated text has been blocked by our content filters. The second barrage of Hedgehogs struck one target at 13:58. The England's hull trembled as it registered the muted explosion that reverberated across the ocean. The submarine sustained damage. Nevertheless, it was not completely destroyed. Though the sonar equipment was able to pick up the sounds of the grinding of broken gear, the I-16 continued to maintain its maneuverability. The third assault occurred around 1410 hours. After the strike, The reading from the fathometer indicated that the submarine was really at a depth of 325 feet, which was deeper than the 200 feet that Williamson had predicted as the target depth. The Hedgehog missiles had gone over the heads of the people without causing any harm. The I-16's commander was demonstrating greater competence than anticipated, utilizing all of the tactical advantages that were available. The submarine made a drastic change of direction at the very last second, which caused the fourth strike to be unsuccessful. The operators of the hydrophones on board I-16 had learnt to time the patterns of the attacks made by American forces. They would count the seconds between the sonar pings in order to forecast when weapons would be discharged. Make an immediate turn to the left by applying full rudder. Discharge negative ballast. Alter the depth by 50 feet. Common evasive techniques that had been effective in allowing Japanese submarines to remain operational throughout the duration of the Pacific War. Williamson completed his last estimate at 14:33 hours, determining that the target's bearing was 170 degrees, the range was 400 yards, and the depth was 250 feet. The fifth Hedgehog strike by England caused 4 to 6 bullets to penetrate the pressure hull of the I-16. This was determined by the sonar propagation delay. The explosion caused the England's fantail to be pulled completely out of the water. As the shockwave passed through both vessels, the men were knocked off of their feet. In the forward torpedo compartment of the I-16, salt water gushed through damaged hull plates. The emergency lighting system malfunctioned. The bow of the submarine was directed toward the ocean floor, which was 3 miles below. 20 minutes after that, trash started to rise to the surface of the water. Life preservers that had Japanese characters written on them, wooden planks, and oil slicks that stretched out across the tranquil Pacific Ocean. The I-16 and its crew of 94 men were 2 more additions to the ever-growing list of Japanese submarines that would never make it back to their home port. However, more than one communication had been decrypted by Fleet Radio Unit Pacific. On May 20th, cryptographers cracked a second Japanese transmission. This transmission revealed the location of the 7th Submarine Squadron's patrol line, which consisted of 7 submarines positioned across a route that Admiral William Halsey had used twice before to move the Third Fleet. The submarines were RO-104, RO-105, RO-106, RO-108, RO-109, RO-112, and RO-116. The strategy of Admiral Toyota was tactically smart, since it involved placing submarines at strategic areas where American carrier task forces would be at their most vulnerable point. The approach also required forcing the adversary to either accept assaults from submarines or detour around the patrol line, which would add days to transit times. The strategy expected that individual submarines would be detected by American anti-submarine forces, but that these forces would be unable to find and kill a whole squadron before the patrol line was moved to a new location. Commander Hamilton Haynes, who was in charge of the Escort Division 39, was given the instructions to sweep the Japanese patrol line from west to east. 7 hostile submarines versus 3 destroyer escorts. The mathematics appeared to be in favor of the Japanese, but mathematical calculations did not take into consideration the technical advantages that the Americans possessed or the extraordinary precision of the USS England's Hedgehog system. On May 22nd, around 0350 hours, the USS George discovered the RO-106. A submarine on the surface has been detected by radar. It is 8 nautical miles away. The Japanese submarine had been operating on the surface in order to charge its batteries. This was a perilous technique because it left the submarine open to discovery. The target was verified by searchlight illumination as the George's 5-inch guns turned to engage the contact. The harm was already done despite the fact that RO-106 crash-dived in just 38 seconds. The approximate position and course of the submarine were known to the Americans. The USS George launched an attack at 0415 using Hedgehogs, but the submarine evaded the strike by maneuvering at a depth of 200 feet, so the attack missed its target. The hydrophone operators on the Japanese boat had picked up the approaching bullets and had started emergency protocols. At 0425, the USS England re-established sonar contact. The battle with the I-16 had provided Williamson with valuable information that he used to develop his assault methodology. Compute target depth based on sonar propagation time, factor in submarine escape speed and turning radius, and anticipate the most likely position of the submarine 60 seconds after initial contact. His initial strike on the Hedgehog failed to make contact, but the second attack at 0501 struck RO-106's hull at least 3 times directly. There was a tremendous column of water and debris that sprang forth from the ocean as a result of the undersea explosion, which was visible from the surface. There were a number of different points along the RO-106's pressure hull where breaches had occurred. The mechanisms for emergency ballast tanks malfunctioned. All 59 of the crew members perished as the submarine sunk by the stern. In the span of 4 days, 2 submarines were obliterated. The pattern was beginning to take shape for Japanese naval intelligence, who were monitoring the radio traffic in the vicinity. The 7th Submarine Squadron was being hunted down by American anti-submarine troops, who were employing tactics and weaponry that had never been seen before in a systematic manner. Radio silence was ordered for all of the surviving submarines, and they were instructed to refrain from operating on the surface until absolutely necessary. These instructions were sent to them in the form of emergency communications. The Americans, however, had momentum and technological advantages that the Japanese were unable to match. The Americans had radar systems that were able to detect submarines at distances of more than 10 miles, sonar equipment that was sufficiently precise to follow targets through thermal layers and ocean currents, and the Hedgehog weapon system that eliminated the traditional weaknesses of depth charge attacks. Dropping depth charges over the stern of the target submarine required that ships that were attacking pass directly over the submarine before dropping the explosives. This led to the creation of a key vulnerability period during which sonar contact was lost, and the submarine was able to carry out evasive maneuvers. To make matters worse, the explosions from the depth charges generated turbulence and acoustic interference, which made it impossible for sonar operators to re-establish contact for up to 15 minutes following each strike. Both of the issues were resolved by the Hedgehog. The ship that was attacking maintained constant sonar contact while it fired projectiles in front of itself. Attacks that failed to make a connection did not cause any auditory interference, which enabled fast follow-up engagements. The contact fusing technique ensured that only direct strikes would detonate, which eliminated misleading damage assessment and sound masking. The third submarine to come into contact with the American hunter-killer group was RO-104. At around 0600 hours on the morning of May 23rd, the United States Navy ship Raby identified a submarine on radar as it traveled on the surface of the water. At that time, the submarine was roughly 250 nautical miles north-northwest of Caviang, New Ireland. RO-104 went underwater 45 seconds after initial contact, but this 45 seconds was sufficient for the American fire control systems to generate an accurate firing solution since the submarine's radar detection equipment functioned correctly. The exact coordinates for the target course, the speed, and the diving point had now been determined. Between the hours of 6:17 and 7:15, the submarine's captain attempted more frantic evasive techniques, resulting in 4 unsuccessful Hedgehog strikes by the USS Raby. In an effort to interfere with the sonar of the Americans, the Japanese submarine attempted to jam it with bursts of tuned sound impulses. This countermeasure was only partially successful because it was able to mask the acoustic signature of the submarine. These countermeasures included making emergency course changes at random intervals, varying the depth between 50 and 300 feet, and releasing compressed air to create false acoustic targets. All of these techniques were learned through 3 years of combat in the Pacific. The attack commenced at 07:17, at which point the USS George joined in. It was unsuccessful in all of its 5 successive Hedgehog attacks. The commander of the submarine was demonstrating an exceptional level of expertise in evasive maneuvers. He was taking advantage of the temperature gradients and ocean currents to conceal the location of his vessel. He was doing this through emergency rudder movements, silent running with the least amount of noise possible from the propeller, and manipulation of the ballast tanks to change the depth of the submarine without leaving any acoustic signatures that could be detected. Executive Officer Williamson started the calculations for his last strike at 0819. RO-104 had been avoiding capture for more than 2 hours, depleting its stocks of compressed air and battery power at rates that were not sustainable. In order to preserve energy for critical systems, the submarine would need to minimize its evasive maneuvers. On the basis of the criteria of energy conservation, Williamson plotted the target's most likely position and authorized the attack of England. The region around the target was surrounded by 24 Hedgehog missiles at 0834. RO-104's pressure hull was subjected to a barrage of direct impacts, totaling 10 to 12. When salt water entered the engine room and forward battery compartments, the emergency ballast tank system of the submarine was immediately triggered. An enormous explosion occurred underwater 3 minutes later. It was caused by the bursting of the pressurized air cylinders that remained on the submarine. At 10:45, debris and oil made their way to the surface. Every single one of the 58 members of the crew perished. Over the course of 5 days, 3 submarines were obliterated. The chances of achieving such a victory by employing conventional anti-submarine weaponry would have been almost non-existent from a purely mathematical standpoint. In early 1942, depth charges produced death rates of roughly 3%. By the conclusion of the war, this number had increased to 30% as tactics and technology improved. The Hedgehog's success rate of 20% constituted a 6-fold improvement in lethality, yet the statistics only reflected a portion of the tale. The psychological effects that the remaining Japanese submarine personnel experienced were just as terrible. Radio intercepts showed that commanders of submarines were attempting to gain authorization to leave their patrol stations and retreat to regions that were safer. Reports on morale that were extracted from stolen documents showed that submarine sailors were becoming apprehensive about the superweapons that the Americans possessed, which were able to achieve precision that was previously thought to be unattainable. On May 24th, around 01:20 hours, the submarine RO-116 was discovered by the USS George as it was on its regular patrol pattern. There is a surface target approaching the eastern end of the patrol line at a speed of 12 knots. Radar contact was made with the target at a distance of 8 miles. It would appear that the captain of the submarine had come to the conclusion that speed was of more importance than stealth, a calculated gamble that ultimately turned out to be his undoing. The submarine initiated an emergency dive around ERA 150, and the USS England picked up the submarine on sonar at the same time. The procedures for a crash dive were finished in 35 seconds, but the calculations for an assault from the United States were already underway. In order to account for the patterns of evasion exhibited by Japanese forces that had been noticed in prior encounters, Williamson had updated his technique. The initial strike by a Hedgehog resulted in 3 to 5 direct impacts on RO-116's hull at 0214 hours. A major secondary explosion did not accompany the destruction of the submarine, which is a departure from the events of past battles. The newer Japanese submarines had undergone improvements to their damage control systems, but they were unable to control the flooding that occurred as a result of the multiple breaches in the hull below the waterline. The water was filled with the sounds of breaking up noises that were created by the internal bulkheads collapsing under pressure, the emergency venting of the ballast tanks as the crew attempted to restore buoyancy, and the failure of the propeller shaft bearing as seawater flooded the engine room. Before the RO-116 was swallowed up by the deep ocean with all 56 members of its crew, 20 minutes of the submarine's last noises were picked up by sonar equipment. Over the course of 6 days, 4 submarines were obliterated. The unparalleled success record of the USS England was starting to get notice from high-ranking naval commanders across the whole Pacific theater. In order to get a better understanding of England's tactical procedures and weapon efficacy, Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, made a request for comprehensive after-action reports. Admiral Ernest King, who was the chief of naval operations at the time, initiated plans to re-equip more destroyer escorts with better Hedgehog systems. The pursuit, however, was a long way from coming to an end. The Japanese naval intelligence forces were starting to comprehend the extent of the catastrophe that had befallen the 7th Submarine Squadron, and there were still 3 submarines that remained on patrol. Emergency instructions were sent out directing the abandonment of individual patrol stations and the concentration of the surviving submarines into a defensive configuration that would be able to give mutual assistance against strikes from the United States. On the 26th of May, the escort carrier USS Hogget Bay, along by 4 Fletcher-class destroyers, arrived to provide assistance to the England, George, and Raby, forming a hunter-killer group. The 3 destroyer escorts had been carrying out continuous operations over a period of 8 days, during which they had been using up ammunition and gasoline at a rate that made a quick replenishment absolutely necessary. It would have been standard practice to return to the port in order to restock supplies and give the crew some rest, but Commander Haynes sought permission to perform one further sweep of the patrol area while on the way to the port of Manus, where the crew could be resupplied. There was an interception of intelligence that indicated that RO-108 was operating in the neighborhood, probably with the intention of attempting to meet with the remaining submarines in order to evacuate to safer seas in a coordinated manner. On May 26th, at 23:04 hours, the USS England discovered the RO-108. At a distance of 1,500 yards, there is a sonar contact. The target is traveling at a speed of 8 knots on a southeastern heading. The submarine was operating underwater at a shallow depth, possibly with the objective of maximizing its speed while keeping the amount of battery power it consumed to a minimum for prolonged operations. The computation of Williamson's assault calculation was finished in less than 3 minutes after initial contact had been made. The sonar propagation characteristics indicate that the target depth is about 120 feet below the surface. The course has remained unaltered since the initial discovery, indicating that the commander of the submarine was either oblivious of the existence of the Americans or was seeking to escape pursuit instead of engaging in evasive maneuvers. Multiple bullets were sent into the hull of RO-108 when England's Hedgehog strike occurred at 23:23. The submarine was obliterated rapidly and thoroughly. This annihilation was accompanied by a large undersea explosion that caused the surface of the ocean to be lighted by phosphorescent bubbles and debris. The battery compartments of the submarine remained to provide emergency lighting underwater for several minutes after the electrical systems had fully failed. Over the course of 8 days, 5 submarines were obliterated. The greatest successful anti-submarine patrol in Navy history had been carried out by the USS England. Yet there was still one target left. Lieutenant Junichi Inoue was in command of RO-105, while Captain Ryuzo Suko, who was the commander of Submarine Division 51, was traveling as a guest. In November of 1943, RO-105 was constructed at the Sasebo Naval Arsenal and put into service. Her crew had already been able to escape many engagements with American submarines and planes during operations conducted in the past. 2 torpedoes were launched by the submarine USS Tarpon on August 12, 1943. The submarine was able to narrowly evade them by taking dramatic evasive maneuvers. The light cruiser USS Columbia had been the target of torpedoes fired by RO-105 in September 1943, but the attack had been unsuccessful because the target had maneuvered out of the way. The submarine had also successfully completed a number of rescue operations, including the retrieval of Japanese aviators from the waters surrounding the Solomon Islands and New Guinea that were being disputed. RO-105 was the most deadly target that remained in the 7th Submarine Squadron because of the experience of its crew and the tactical expertise of its captain. The intelligence branch of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 6th Fleet had been successful in intercepting and decoding American radio messages, which revealed the approximate location of the USS England and the ships that were traveling with her. RO-105 was given emergency instructions to evade any interaction with American troops and to retreat to Truk in order to rearm and make substitutions for its crew. However, because to constraints on fuel and battery capacity, a retreat without running on the surface through regions that are known to be monitored by American aircraft was not feasible at the time. RO-105 was operating on the surface around 2130 hours when the USS George first saw it, marking the beginning of the last confrontation on May 29th. Her location and path were now known to American fire control systems, but the submarine crash-dived very shortly after that. The 2 teams pushed themselves to their utmost as they engaged in a fight of attrition that lasted 25 hours. Throughout the night, the USS George launched multiple Hedgehog attacks, but they all missed their target. The submarine was increasingly erratic in its evasion patterns, making it difficult to target. Every 3 minutes, the submarine made emergency course changes, and its depth varied between 60 and 300 feet. The submarine was running silently at the minimum propeller speed to reduce its acoustic signature. The submarine also employed counter-detection measures, including bursts of compressed air to create false sonar targets. The Hedgehog ammo that both the USS George and the USS Raby were carrying had been used up almost completely by the time that daylight broke on May 30th, and neither of the 2 ships had been able to get a kill. The commander of the RO-105 exhibited unparalleled expertise in the field of submarine warfare. Every method possible to prevent destruction was employed by the commander, including the manipulation of emergency ballast tanks in order to adjust the angle of the trim, the reduction of propeller cavitation by precise speed control, and the deployment of sound decoys at crucial junctures. The principal attack was carried out by Raby and George, while the USS England was under Commander Haynes's orders to remain in reserve. According to conventional tactical doctrine, the most effective unit should be kept for use in future operations, rather than being put in danger by participating in confrontations that are drawn out. However, following 24 hours of failed attacks, Haines took the choice that would mark the completion of England's historic feat. The England's final attack was given the green light at 07:36 on May 30th, at which point the radio communication, "Oh hell, go ahead, England," was broadcast. Based on the submarine's observed evasive tendencies, Executive Officer Williamson had been following the battle and calculating the best assault parameters. These parameters included a target depth of roughly 200 feet, a path that varied but was typically southwestward in the direction of Bougainville, and a speed that had been decreased in order to save the power of the batteries. 6 to 10 direct hits on the pressure hull of RO-105 were scored at 07:36 during the attack on England's Hedgehog. The pressurized air systems of the submarine broke, and salt water filled all compartments at the same time at 0741, which was immediately followed by a massive explosion. The 7th Submarine Squadron was completely destroyed as oil and debris erupted to the surface. RO-105 was lost along with the 55 men on board, including Captain Ryuzo Suko, who was one of the most seasoned submarine commanders in the Imperial Navy. His passing was not just the loss of his particular competence, but also the loss of institutional knowledge that had been accrued over the course of years of operations in the Pacific theater of war. In 12 days, 6 submarines were obliterated. The accomplishments of the USS England were unmatched in the history of the war against submarines and would never be surpassed. The guided missile destroyer USS England was commissioned in 1960, and the name and heritage that it carried on were those of Admiral Ernest King, who had made the pledge that there will always be an England in the United States Navy. However, the tactical ramifications were well beyond what could be accomplished by a single man. A dramatic shift in the balance of power in the Pacific War was indicated by the loss of the 7th Submarine Squadron. The intended decisive engagement with American carrier forces, which was known as Admiral Toyoda's Operation A-Go, was compromised prior to its initiation. Japanese naval intelligence was working without vision due to the fact that submarine reconnaissance had not yet been implemented. The classes that were focused on technology were just as important. Between December 1941 and September 1945, American industry manufactured a total of 602,128 depth charges. This number represents a significant investment in traditional anti-submarine weaponry. It was clear that precision should take precedence above quantity in all future naval building projects due to the outstanding performance of the Hedgehog. According to British statistics from World War II, a single submarine would be sunk for every 60 regular depth charge strikes carried out. A 10-fold gain in efficacy was attained by the Hedgehog, which was able to sink 1 submarine for every 6 strikes that it executed. The Hedgehog was a significant advancement in the field of anti-submarine warfare, particularly when it was utilized in conjunction with better sonar technology and radar detection capabilities. The psychological effects on operations using submarines from Japan were almost as catastrophic. The submarine sailors, who had previously operated with confidence in their abilities to dodge strikes from the United States, suddenly found themselves facing weapon systems that appeared to reach inconceivable accuracy. The intercepted documents contained morale reports that suggested that submarine commanders were increasingly reluctant to engage with American surface forces. The loss of the 7th Submarine Squadron elicited a rapid and resolute response from Admiral Toyoda. In order to do away with its reliance on submarine surveillance, a modification was made to Operation A-Go. As the Pacific War reached its latter phase, the number of available resources decreased, which made it necessary to utilize surface boats and airplanes to gather intelligence on the movements of the American fleet. Additionally, the success of the USS England brought attention to the significance of signals intelligence in contemporary naval combat operations. The initial targeting information that made the entire operation feasible was given by the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific's capability to intercept and decode Japanese transmissions. If the American ships had not been privy to early information about the I-16 supply mission and the 7th Submarine Squadron's patrol placements, they would have been searching across enormous expanses of water with a very slim chance of coming into touch with either of them. Another key issue was the quantitative technique that Executive Officer Williamson utilized while developing assault plans. He was able to use sonar propagation data and observed evasion patterns to compute the speed, course, and depth of a target, which converted the process of submarine hunting from an art to a science. It was not until after the war that research revealed that the system developed by Williamson had been applied throughout the whole Pacific Fleet, which had the effect of greatly enhancing the overall efficacy of anti-submarine operations. The accomplishment of England was sobering when considering the human price that was paid. During the 12-day period, around 400 Japanese submariners perished. This number does not only represent the people who were killed immediately, but also the loss of important experience and training. In order to acquire full combat effectiveness, each submarine crew needed to undergo months of specialized education in addition to years of experience in operating settings. There were no casualties on the American side during that same time period. During the search for submarines, not a single member from the crew of the USS England, the USS George, or the USS Raby was killed or injured. This gap in the number of deaths was not just a result of technical advances. Rather, it was a result of greater training, tactics, and leadership at every level of command. The larger consequences of the situation were disastrous for activities conducted by submarines that were operated by Japan. The Imperial Navy had entered World War II with a fleet of 63 submarines, but by May 1944, this number had been whittled down to fewer than 30 active submarines. The loss of 7 more submarines over a period of 12 days constituted an unacceptably high attrition rate that could not be continued to be sustained given the current capabilities in terms of building. The shipyards in Japan were manufacturing submarines at a pace of around 1 boat per month, but the anti-submarine forces in the United States were attaining kill rates that were far higher than the replacement capacity. The mathematical equation was unavoidable. Long before American naval power could be substantially diminished, Japanese submarine forces would be obliterated as a result of attrition. The difference in technical advancement was just as significant. Under the most favorable circumstances, surface submarines might be seen by American radar systems at distances of more than 15 miles. American troops were able to exploit the vulnerabilities of Japanese submarines with devastating success, because the Japanese submarines had to surface in order to charge their batteries and refill their air. Many of the typical advantages that submarine commanders had previously enjoyed were no longer applicable due to advancements in sonar technology. The early war AIC systems were confined to forward search patterns and lost touch with the target during attack approaches. The quality control team of the USS England. Throughout combat sequences, sonar devices maintained target tracking, so supplying weapon systems with continuous targeting data. The conclusion of 3 years of research of weapons designed to combat submarines was the Hedgehog's contact fusing system. Explosions using conventional depth charges detonated at pre-selected depths, generating enormous underwater disturbances that concealed following sonar encounters. The Hedgehog bullets were designed to explode just when they made direct contact with the hulls of submarines, which prevented acoustic interference and for quick follow-up strikes to be carried out. The production data made it clear that the American industry was making a significant commitment to the fight against submarines. By the time the war came to a close, the United States had created thousands of K-gun launchers and Hedgehog projectiles, in addition to more than 600,000 depth charges and the corresponding fire control equipment. The strategic importance of submarine warfare in the Pacific theater was acknowledged with this large expenditure in specialist armament. Thousands of sonar operators, depth charge crews, and anti-submarine experts were developed by training programs. New anti-submarine warfare professionals were being graduated from American Navy schools at a rate that exceeded the capabilities of Japanese training facilities. This resulted in a cumulative advantage that continued to grow as time went on. Expertise and information obtained via operations in Atlantic convoys was quickly imparted to forces in the Pacific theater, which resulted in an increase in institutional understanding and tactical proficiency. The accomplishment of the USS England was the result of a combination of several different technological and tactical elements, including advanced radar and sonar systems, superior weapons technology, signals intelligence, mathematical fire control methods, and highly trained personnel operating with overwhelming industrial support. As the capabilities of the United States continued to improve, Japanese submarines found themselves facing an equation that was becoming increasingly hard to solve. Their own resources were dwindling at the same time. Japanese submarine activities in the Central Pacific had been reduced to a point where they were only conducting token patrols and desperate supply missions by June 1944. The offensive capabilities that had previously made submarine warfare a crucial component of the early conflicts in the Pacific had been significantly reduced as a result of continuous attrition and technological obsolescence. However, the USS England would never again experience the kind of focused success that it had during that 12-day period in May 1944, despite the fact that it would continue operations throughout the Pacific War. Her name had become a byword for anti-submarine prowess, signifying the metamorphosis of undersea warfare from a struggle of stealth and guile to a technical conflict in which the results were determined by better equipment and training. The impact of those 12 days would be felt in the field of naval building and in tactical doctrine for many years to come. Every major navy took a close look at England's tactics and included comparable technology in their anti-submarine arsenals. The submarine's period as an invisible predator was coming to an end, and it was being replaced by a new era in which undersea boats were confronted with ever-advanced detection and destruction capabilities. Admiral Toyoda's Operation A-Go took place in June 1944. It was conducted without any reconnaissance by submarine, and was a contributing factor to the devastating defeat that the Japanese suffered during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Operations like as England's Hunt helped to relieve American carrier forces from the fear of submarines, allowing them to operate with an unparalleled freedom of movement throughout the Central Pacific. The assault technique that Executive Officer Williamson used is going to be regarded as a turning moment in naval warfare, as scientific calculation began to take the place of intuition and experience as the key determinant of success in combat. The mathematical accuracy of this attack methodology is going to be recognized as a turning point in naval warfare. The number of submarines that the USS England had destroyed was not just 6. She had proven that contemporary combat was a domain that was dominated by the faction that possessed better technology, training, and industrial capacity. The 7 Japanese submarines were left to rest on the ocean floor at the depths of the Pacific Ocean. The personnel of these submarines were lauded by both sides for their bravery in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. However, technical disadvantages made it such that human ability and drive could no longer prevail, which is what their sacrifice symbolized at the conclusion of an era. The nations who were capable of creating weapons such as the Hedgehog and training operators, like those who served aboard the USS England, had the upper hand in the future.